There is a particular irony in the story of James Armistead that no amount of time or recognition has fully dissolved. He was a man who risked his life to win a war fought in its highest rhetoric for the principle that all men are created equal and endowed with the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He was among the most effective intelligence operatives of that war, and when the war was over and the new nation celebrated its freedom, he went back to being enslaved. The men whose freedom he had helped secure did not secure his. He had to fight for it himself. James Armistead was born into slavery in Virginia, the exact year uncertain, but likely around 1760, the property of a man named William Armistead of New Kent County. The records of enslaved people in 18th century Virginia are incomplete in the way that the records of people considered property always are. Their births were not always formally documented. Their inner lives were not considered worth preserving. Their individuality existed in the historical record only in fragments. What we know about James Armistead comes largely from the record of what he did, not from the kind of biographical documentation that was routinely created for the white men around him. What he did was extraordinary. In 1781, the American Revolution had been going for 6 years, and its outcome was still genuinely uncertain. The British, under the command of General Lord Cornwallis, were operating in Virginia with considerable effectiveness, threatening the supply lines and political infrastructure of the American cause in the South. Cornwallis was a skilled general with a substantial force, and the ability of Washington's Continental Army to dislodge him depended critically on accurate intelligence about British positions, strength, and intentions. James Armistead went to the Marquis de Lafayette, the French aristocrat who had become one of Washington's most trusted commanders and who was responsible for American operations in Virginia, and asked to serve. Lafayette agreed. What James proposed, or what was proposed for him, was one of the most dangerous intelligence operations of the war. He would infiltrate the British camps by presenting himself as a runaway slave seeking British protection. This was not an implausible cover. The British had been offering freedom to enslaved people who escaped from rebel masters and came over to their side. It was a policy designed both to weaken the American war effort and to build a labor and military force from the enslaved population. Thousands of people had taken this route. An enslaved man presenting himself at a British camp was not unusual. It was, in fact, exactly what the British expected and encouraged. What they did not expect was that he was working for Lafayette. James made contact with Benedict Arnold, the American general who had defected to the British in 1780 and was now commanding British operations in Virginia. He made himself useful. He was personable, intelligent, and possessed of the particular quality that makes a great intelligence operative, the ability to make powerful people feel comfortable in his presence, to seem non-threatening while absorbing everything. He moved freely through the British camp, listening to conversations, observing troop dispositions, noting the details of supply and logistics that told a trained observer everything about an army's capabilities and intentions. He passed what he learned to Lafayette. The route was necessarily indirect, messages carried by intermediaries, information transmitted through a network of contacts whose identities were carefully protected. The intelligence he provided was detailed, accurate, and actionable. Lafayette used it to track British movements, avoid traps, and position American forces to respond effectively to
to Cornwallis's operations. Then, Cornwallis himself recruited James as a guide and scout. This was the intelligence coup of the entire operation. James was now inside the command structure of the British Army in Virginia, trusted by the general himself, present in conversations and planning sessions that no American operative should have been able to access. He observed, he listened, he remembered, and he reported. What he reported in the summer and fall of 1781 helped shape one of the most consequential strategic decisions of the American Revolution. Washington and the French commander Rochambeau were planning a major operation, and the question of where to strike, whether to move against New York or to pivot south and trap Cornwallis in Virginia, depended partly on accurate intelligence about British strength and positioning. The intelligence that came through Lafayette's network, much of it originating with James, contributed to the decision to move south.
The result was the Siege of Yorktown. Cornwallis, trapped at Yorktown on the Virginia coast by the convergence of Washington's army from the north, Lafayette's forces from the west, and a French fleet that had defeated the British Navy and cut off any escape by sea, surrendered on October 19, 1781. It was the decisive military event of the American Revolution. The war continued in other theaters for 2 more years, but Yorktown effectively ended the British will to continue fighting. The nation that James Armistead had helped create was born. He went back to the plantation of William Armistead. The Virginia law that governed the freedom of enslaved people who had served in the military during the Revolution was specific about who qualified. Soldiers, men who had borne arms in the Continental service. Intelligence operatives, spies, were not mentioned. James had not been a soldier in the formal sense. He had been something rarer and more dangerous, but the law did not recognize the distinction in his favor. He petitioned for his freedom. His petition was denied. For several years after the end of the Revolution, James Armistead remained enslaved. He continued to live in Virginia, in the county where he had been born, on the property of the man who owned him, in a country whose founding document proclaimed that all men were created equal, and whose practice demonstrated with brutal consistency exactly how narrowly the word men was being interpreted. Lafayette came to America on a return visit in 1784. He met James. He was appalled at the situation and wrote a personal testimonial on James's behalf, a letter that described, in the terms of a commanding officer assessing an operative whose work he had directly depended on, exactly what James had contributed to the American cause. The letter was addressed to the Virginia legislature. It made a difference. In 1787, the Virginia legislature passed a special act granting James Armistead his freedom. He was one of the few enslaved people to receive individual legislative action of this kind. He took the surname Lafayette in honor of the French general who had fought for his freedom as he had fought for the nation's. He became a free man. He farmed. He lived in New Kent County, Virginia, for the rest of his life. He married and had children. He applied for and received a pension from the state of Virginia, a modest recognition of his service. When Lafayette returned to America again in 1924 for a celebrated tour of the nation he had helped create, he and James Armistead Lafayette met again. James was in his 60s, a free man for nearly 40 years. Lafayette was 76, celebrated everywhere he went as a hero of 2 revolutions. When they encountered each other, Lafayette embraced him. A portrait was made of the moment, an image of 2 old men who had worked together toward a shared goal, one of whom had been celebrated for it his entire life, and one of whom had spent 6 years after the war
fighting for the freedom the war had been fought to establish. He won a war for a freedom he was not allowed to share. And then, with the same persistence and intelligence that had made him an extraordinary operative, he fought the government he had saved until it gave him what it had promised. Not as a gift, as a right. He was right. It took them 6 years to agree.